It's never a Zoom meeting without a technical difficulty or two. So we've got that out of the way. That'll smooth the road maybe for what Kate has for us ahead. So please join me then in welcoming Kate Maxwell.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here with you this morning, and I'm especially delighted because this invitation gave me an excuse to read the rule itself from cover to cover at one sitting. I don't get the opportunity to do that very often. I usually read it in pieces, small pieces with commentary. And it's a very different experience to read it all in one sitting. It's like reading the Gospel of Mark all at once. So thank you for that. Before I start talking about Benedict's rule particularly, I just want to say a bit about rules of life in general. And let me share my screen if I can. Let's see. Okay, what is this? Now, are you able to see what I'm sharing? Somebody?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great. I never know whether these things are working or not.
Sorry, Kate, no, that is not showing up.
It isn't.
No.
Oh, that's too bad. Let me cancel that then and try it the other way.
Got
Is
it.
that showing up?
Yes,
Okay.
it is. Well done.
Great. Wonderful. All right. Well, about rules of life in general. The idea of having a rule of life is not a new idea, of course. It's been around for centuries and centuries, indeed millennia, because there were Buddhist monks that had a rule of life of their own decades and centuries before Christian monks. But early in the 3rd century Common Era, individual Christians were going into the desert to live ascetically, and eventually small communities, for the most part, grew up around them, and they grew along the Nile and in Syria. So even those who went out individually had a rule of life, but it became more structured when there were communities of people. If you are considering writing a rule of life for yourself, there is good news. Whether you know it or not, you already have one. Everybody has a rule of life. We probably just haven't thought about it. Just look at your calendar or schedule. Add in, if you already haven't, time for sleeping and eating and being with family, and work and exercise and all that sort of thing. And there in front of you is a sketch of your rule of life. Because a rule of life is simply a way to decide what's important to you in life. Time that you spend on things and people tells you what you value. So it's good to do this exercise every so often to write up what you're spending your time on, because it tells you what you value. And as time goes by, things get added into our schedule and therefore into our rule of life that may not fit our values. They may not align so well because they're urgent things that other people want us to do. So it can be useful to start by listing what you value. We value a lot of things. What I have on the slide is simply the things that we usually have to put on our calendars, but there are other things: relationships, achievement, prayer, solitude, community, recognition, work, peace, silence, fun, time with family, study, friends. There are a lot of things we value. And so the question isn't, are my values okay? But rather, is there a balance in my life among the values I hold? Does what I do with my time reflect what is valuable to me? So the rule of life you see on your calendar is actually what's happening, while your values tell you what you would like to have happen. And it's interesting to compare the two. You might do this exercise in the next week. Just take a piece of paper and write down, or use your calendar. And then in another piece of paper, write down the things that you value the most, and see how much time you're spending on what you value the most. If you value relationships and you're working 60 hours a week, well, what is that saying about the time that you actually spend with friends and family? If I value exercise and I'm going from 6 in the morning till 9 at night and I'm exhausted, where is the time to do what I say I value? If I value my relationship with God and find that I'm running from one meeting to another all day and into the night, how will I nourish that relationship or any other? So the rule of Benedict is one tool among many spiritual tools to help keep a balance among what is important and what I actually do with my time. The word rule, used in this context, actually means measure, as in a ruler. It isn't about rules and regulations as we usually think of them. I think that's an easy way to come to the rule of Benedict, is to think it's about rules and regulations, and it really isn't. Although there are rules and regulations within most any rule of life. Think of a rule of life, and the rule of Benedict in particular, as a guideline for a way of living. Now, the rule of Benedict was written in the 6th century, some time ago, but it was a time much like ours. There was great political unrest, economic chaos, and social unrest. There were great migrations from one part of the world to another, and the movement of whole peoples and tribes. It was a period of transition between the stable but ruthless government of the Roman Empire to the early part of what we call the Middle Ages, where there wasn't a central dominant political power. Benedict was born into all this upheaval at the end of the 5th century and never knew any other world, as we never know any other world than our own. He went to Rome as a young man to study, and he was sickened at the lack of order and morality in the city. So he fled to the countryside. He spent a few years as a hermit in a cave at Subiaco and learned a great deal about himself during that time, and was asked by a group of monks who lived nearby to be their abbot. He didn't want to do it, but he finally gave in and said he would. And as he had intuited, it did not end well. He was a bit too strict for them, and they tried to poison him. He escaped. Legend has it by the way of a raven taking the poison bread out of his hand and the poison cup, knocking it over. That's why you'll find a raven in most icons of Saint Benedict. And he went back to his cave for a number of years. He eventually founded a group of monks, several groups of monks actually, in that area. And it grew to 12 monasteries, and it became too much for him. So like many of the monastics, he went to the mountains, and there he founded another community called Monte Cassino, which is an enormous abbey that is still standing today in spite of being bombed during World War II, because it was being used by the Germans as a fortress. During the years of working with various communities, particularly the years in Monte Cassino, he wrote the work that we know as the Rule of Benedict. Now, Benedict did not write the rule from scratch. He did what was usual at that time, and he took another rule, more than one actually, and used parts of them for his rule, left out parts of them, and wrote other pieces for him by himself. And the decisions he made that way leave us with a remarkably balanced and gentle rule of life for the 6th century. Now, when you read the rule by itself, you might not think it's either gentle or balanced, but it is. Compared to other rules of the time, his was absolutely easygoing because he made sure that the monks in his monasteries had enough to eat, had enough to drink, enough sleep, time to read and study, as well as time to work and pray. Now, his was a rule for lay people. And this is something that people often miss because we think of monastics as somehow clericalized, but monastics are lay people unless they're ordained. And so he wrote his rule for lay people. He very reluctantly made provision for priests and deacons. He made it very clear that clerical monks wouldn't get any special treatment and that the norm was lay people. So his rule is about relationships. The rule is really about how do we live with one another, how do we care for one another, and it's meant for the laity. There are a number of values that the rule holds up for consideration. And I'd like to look briefly at some of these and what they might say to us about a rule of life for ourselves and what they might say about the way of love. The Benedictine vows have values. Now, not everyone is called to make Benedictine vows, obviously. Most people aren't. There are relatively few Benedictines in the world compared to the population. But it's a particular way of following the Christian life and our baptismal commitment. There are values within each of the pieces of the Benedictine vows. The first one is stability. And it both has a particular resonance and difficulty in our age. It means literally to stand there, to stay put. Ours is a culture of transience and of moving on. And so stability is a tension with the values of our culture. In Benedictine communities that are residential, they live in monasteries, stability has always been interpreted as meaning staying in that particular monastery for life. But stability has a wider meaning. In communities like my own that are dispersed, meaning we don't live together, we live individually or with our families and make our own living and that sort of thing. Stability really has to do with steadfastness in relationship. It's about being willing to hang in there with people. Now that's true. It's a mark of inner stability to stay with something even when the going gets rough. And so that has to do with staying in conversation with a friend when we're having an argument. It has to do with continuing to worship in a community when the leadership does something that annoys you. Stability does not mean always agreeing or not stating what my concerns and insights are. I'm called to be authentically who I am, but stability does require that I stay connected. So connection in relationship is the essence of stability, and I think it's valuable for all of us, Benedictines or not. The second vow that Benedictines take is obedience, and that has a tricky connotation in our culture. Obedience tends to bring up images of military-like precision and blind obedience, doing whatever you're told when you're told it and not thinking very much. But that's not Benedictine obedience at all. The word from which obedience comes is audire, which means to listen. And ob audire, which is the original of obedience, means to listen toward or listen to. It's a disposition of inclination of our ear. So it has to do with listening. And because listening by itself is a very passive thing, it has to do with response. If I listen and really hear someone, I will want to respond to them in some way. And so God calls me in all sorts of ways, in a family request, in the plight of a friend, the need of strangers halfway around the globe. God calls me in a lot of ways. And if I'm attentive and I'm willing to respond, I hear God's voice in the people and circumstances of daily life. So obedience is really about listening and responding. The third value, the third part of the rule, the vows of the rule, is fidelity. Now, this comes from a phrase that is very difficult to translate, and these days is usually translated as fidelity to monastic life. It encompasses both stability and obedience, so there are ways in which it's an overarching value. It has to do with really being faithful to your own way of life for lay people. It wouldn't make much sense for people who aren't professing Benedictine vows to be faithful to monastic life, because you're not called to be monastics necessarily. So we listen and respond, and we're faithful to life as it presents itself to us and to the way of life that we have chosen. So if I'm married, it's fidelity to that way of life. If I'm a professor, it's fidelity to that way of life. There's all sorts of ways I can be faithful or unfaithful in my own way of life. And the vows call us to be faithful to fidelity itself. Now, another value in rule beyond the vows is the value of study. Benedict set aside time every day, and the best time of day, in fact, he did it before the work time, for the monks to study scripture and other holy books. And this was generally called Lectio Divina. It included the act of reading or hearing if you were illiterate, and meditation on what you read or heard. Now, monks memorized the entire Psalter to use in the daily office and the canticles that are used, and they memorized large portions of scripture as well, because they could then pray with them at any time that they were not occupied with something else. They didn't have to have a book, which was expensive and difficult to find, with them. Now, we don't necessarily memorize scripture, but we do need to ruminate on it, to sit with it, to think about it. Ruminate is an interesting word because it's reflective of what cows do when they eat. They chew their cud, and it goes to a second stomach and then moves back into the mouth, and they ruminate on it so that they're actually physically allowing it to fill their being. And that's what we do with scripture when we're studying. It's not study in terms of an intellectual curiosity, although that may be there. The importance of it is we're allowing the word to speak to us. And so we need that as much as the monks of the 6th century did. So spending time hearing and reading scripture is important. I know that we get a fair amount of scripture in our worship services, but it's not nearly enough to hear the gospel once a week. So it's important to go back and do some reading of the scriptures as well and reflect on it. Now, monks had another kind of learning and study they did, and that was in community. They learned how to love other people by living with other people. Benedict saw community as a great value, which rules before him didn't necessarily see community in the same way. They were generally relationships between a master or abbot and a disciple or monk, so that it was a one-on-one relationship and it was a teaching relationship. That's the way monasticism developed in the desert, where there would be an Abba or Amma who was revered, and people would come to that monk or nun for teaching, and they would live with them and imitate them. Benedict said, we can do that in community by imitating and listening to one another. So Benedict actually talked about living together in love, loving one another as important, not just your relationship with the superior, and that it was important to listen to one another, to do mutual obedience. So obedience to listen to deeply happened in community as well as with whoever was the superior of the community. So that's a very important, it's a very important value, and one that I think in this time of pandemic, we are experiencing the lack of it. We are made for community and we hunger for that. I think one of the things that makes it most difficult to get by during these days of pandemic is not being with each other. It helps to be able to see each other on formats like Zoom, but it's not the same. And we still have this longing for community. And so to incorporate that as part of our rule of life is very important. Another important value in the rule is prayer. And if you've read the rule at all, you will see that a good many chapters are spent on prayer and the regulation of it. Benedict writes a lot about common prayer, not so much about personal prayer, but he does assume that both happen. They are assumed to be practices. And that is something that we need to think about in our own rules of life. The relationship that we have with God, which is what prayer is about, is the relationship of our life. And it's important that we spend time in common prayer, in worship together. And it's important that we spend time personally, because our relationship with God is not just a common relationship, it's a personal one. And so just like any other relationship, we need to give it time. And so you might look at your calendar and see where are you spending time with God? Just time with God. It might be praying prayers, or it might be just sitting quietly. But that's a very important aspect of a rule of life. Our relationship with God is like any other relationship in our lives, and the alchemy of friendship and love requires time. So look at your calendar and see what time you have for prayer, personal prayer. Benedict also saw the value in work and provided time for it and provided for it for all members of the community. Everyone, even the elderly and infirm, had work of some sort to do. And in our society, we tend to think of work as a necessary evil, but Benedict didn't see it that way. He saw work as an essential blessing that we give to the world and ourselves, because it's a way of expressing our gifts and expressing who we are. And he saw it as necessary and a gift. So whether we work in manual labor or in personal interactions or in a helping profession in hospitality industry with children or elders or writing or study, whatever our work is, it's a way that we bless the world and express ourselves, and it's necessary. That's not one that I'm too concerned about you being able to fit into your time. That usually overtakes most of our time. Another value of Benedictine life is hospitality. And it's a hallmark of Benedictine life. Most people think of Benedictines as being very hospitable. And indeed, the number of monasteries that take in travelers and retreatants grows all the time. That is something that is known about monasteries, Benedictine monasteries in particular, and Benedict provided for that in the very beginning in his rule. He talked about what to do when visitors come to the monastery. We're to receive others as Christ. To receive another as Christ is a dual statement. It means to receive the person as though the person were Christ, and to receive the person in the way that Christ would receive them. So that there's an enormous respect and reverence for those who visit us. And this goes beyond hospitality as serving tea and cookies when somebody comes over. This is really making room for others, making space for them to be who they are, and to for us to be able to go where the other is. It's not just about others coming to us. It's about us being able to enter into the space of other people, making room for them as they are. We're supposed to go to them and pray with them and wash their feet. And we extend ourselves so that the stranger may be at home with us. And that's something that in our culture, we don't think about very much. We're in such a time of division, economically and socially and politically. And in this time of division, as Christians, we're really called to go to the other and extend ourselves in welcome, whether or not we agree with or live the way of the other. Welcome and hospitality don't ignore or play down differences, but it recognizes that in the midst of division and strife, we're all made in the image of God. Everyone is a child of God. And so we're all human beings, and we need to receive one another and make room for one another in that way. So there's a way in which the value of hospitality is the value of reconciliation in the world. And that is our basic mission in life, to reconcile the world and ourselves and everyone else. Finally, I do have a finally, there's a value for holy leisure in the rule. Now, in the rule, leisure is a vital component of monastic life. And it doesn't look like it sometimes if you look at the schedule of monastics, but you will find that there is time in the daily horarium, we call it, for leisure, for time that's not scheduled. And that leisure is not meant to be a time of having fun or filling it up with extracurricular activities. It's meant to be a time of rest and relaxation, and reflection, because you can only do reflection if you have leisure. People whose entire life is hand to mouth and making sure that they're able to eat and that their children can eat don't have leisure. We have a lot of leisure in our part of this society. And so Benedict built it into his monk's time in order to assure that there was the opportunity for reflection on scripture, reflection on our life, reflection on interactions. All of that it provides a pause in the busyness of life where we can acknowledge God's presence and God's call and think about our response to God. Now, I said that that was the last value, and it is. But I want to say that the Benedictine rule was written more than 1,500 years ago. And it was written long before the materials on the way of love. But there are ways in which the way of love correlates with values from the rule. We turn to God and to one another by living the values of stability and listening and faithfulness to our way of life and to our life circumstances. We learn by studying, by scripture, by reading, by living in community and learning from one another. We pray and we worship together in community. We refresh our life of faith both individually and together. We bless, as St. Benedict saw it, by our work in the world. What we do blesses the creation and brings it to fulfillment. We open ourselves and go in hospitality to the other and make room for them. Make room for the fullness of who they are as a person. And finally, we rest. We use our holy leisure to rest and to know that we are in God and that God rests. And so we were made for rest as well. So including the values either of the way of love or of the rule of Benedict gives us a way to put some balance into our lives. Now, balance is not something that is static. As you look at this picture of this young girl here balancing on rocks, which looks rather precarious to me, I'm trusting that the rocks are wider than they look. Balance is a very dynamic thing. There are always moves and shifts that are happening while you're balancing. You don't get into a position and then stay there. The muscles move, the breath moves. There's a give and take. And the same thing is true of our rule of life. There will be a balance, but that doesn't mean everything is the same all the time. And it doesn't mean that we spend equal amounts of time on everything. A rule of life really helps us provide a living balance between and among the aspects of our life. So this picture of the young girl balancing shows that very clearly. So does this one of a cairn of stones piled on top of one another, balanced. We may not see it, but there is movement molecularly going on within those rocks. There's always movement going on in matter. And so we can know that even when things seem to be static, there's movement going on at a level that we can't see. And that's the level where we trust that God is the one doing the moving. And we turn over our way of life to God and allow God to be that movement within us. So I want to stop here and see if there are comments or questions or a conversation we can have. I'm going to unshare, see if that works. Yes, good. And see what all of you have to say. I know there are some here who are Benedictine in their rule of life already, and others who may be interested in it. So you'll need to unmute yourself if you want to say something, to ask a question, or to make a comment. I've been talking for a while, and so you have to you have to realize that you find your voice again.
You've given us a great deal here, Kate, about, I think we might all be on our heels a bit in terms of taking it all in. There's so many points that we could lift up and talk about for quite some time. Since there's a pause, I'll take the host's prerogative and insert a question of my own, and we can see where things go. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more. You spoke about study and in reading scripture in particular as rumination and as more than simply
Yes.
a kind of intellectual grasp of what's happening in the text. And you hinted at a kind of different mode of engagement. One might call it more holistic, contemplative even. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that to a bunch of Episcopalians who might have a tendency toward the more cognitive mode of engagement with scripture. So any thoughts there?
Sure. The way of studying scripture that has developed in the monastic communities and tradition is a very slow reading of scripture. The monks originally read out loud to themselves. So there was a kind of murmuring under their breath that went on while they were reading, because reading was not something that was universally done. And most readers were not as fluent as we are in the reading. And so they didn't read to themselves silently, they read out loud. So if you were in a monastery during that time, you would hear this murmur of voices going on from their different cells. That kind of vocalization and doing it slowly is very foreign to us. We're used to reading for sense rather than for meaning of words. We read in phrases, we read in sentences, we read in paragraphs. We don't usually take the time to go word by word through what we're reading. And with scripture, it is very useful sometimes to simply take a text and read it deliberately and slowly. And this would be a small bit of text. You wouldn't take a whole parable, for example. You might take a part of a parable, unless it's the parable of the mustard seed or something that's very short. You take a small section of scripture and read it to yourself, slowing down, reading as though this were the first time you were going to hear it, sounding out the letters almost, sounding out the words so that they echo within you. And in that echoing, you listen for something that might draw your attention. It might be the sound of a word, or it might be a word that seems jarring, or a word that feels comforting just by the sound of it. And you would take that and allow that experience to simply be resident in you for a while. That's the rumination part. It's a way of allowing it to echo within you, not having to have a lot of ideas about it, but allowing it to echo within you and allowing it to move you to a level where you are actually feeling something about that word or phrase. And you may or may not have words for the feeling, and that's fine. It may move you into prayer of some sort, maybe verbal prayer, but more likely just quiet prayer. Prayer that simply is present to the sound of the word, the word. And you would do this for as long as you're finding value, as long as you're drawn to the word or phrase, you keep doing it. Now that's very countercultural because we read for speed and we read for information. And this way of reading slows it down almost to kindergarten level in terms of going word to word. And it's a way of allowing the word of God to echo in ourselves. Sometimes there is nothing in the word or phrase that you choose, and you're simply repeating word or phrase. Well, what you're doing there is you're memorizing it, and it will be present in you long afterwards, and it might come up at another time. I find that with the Psalms, because as Benedictines, we use the Psalms a great deal, and we end up memorizing many of them. And I'm seeing a request for people to turn off videos in order to increase the quality of the experience. But when you allow that kind that you don't expect, I discover, never have before, that is worth sitting with. So that would be one way to think about that kind of rumination and reading. And
Question, Kate?
yeah, Barbara.
Where's the fun in this? Where's the art in this? What is the lighter, if there is one, lighter side of this? Right now, things are pretty grim out there, and I think could you maybe talk about that a little bit? What's for you, maybe what's been the lighter side of this? If there is one.
Lighter side. I guess I don't think of it as heavy to begin with. That's part of it. My experience of Benedictine spirituality is that it frees me up when I have a rule of life based on Benedict. I'm freed up to experience life moment by moment because I'm more living in the moment with the Benedictine rule. I'm aware of time because we pray the hours and we stop at determined times in order to turn ourselves more consciously over to God. And in that, I find a great deal of freedom. Fun in it comes in community and comes in study, I think, because there's more to study even than Lectio. Regular intellectual study is also a part of the Benedictine tradition. And I find that to be fun and exciting. But the monastic life isn't exactly a roller coaster ride kind of fun. It's a more smooth and steady, moving along type of life that is an unexciting life, as Michael Casey has described it. It's not a life with a lot of ups and downs in it. So it may not provide the kind of fun that you're talking about. Yes, Judy.
Well, thank you so much for this. There's just such wonderful connections with what you've presented here, and as you made clear with the way of love, as we're going to be studying it over the next few months. And to kind of pick up on what Barbara was saying, I actually love the holy leisure part of this, which, as you well noted, connects with the rest practice of way of love, which is really Sabbath. But I think there's that holy leisure is maybe, Barbara, that place for that joy. It's incorporating time. as you talked about, Kate, I think we all do already have a rule of life. And making time for joy and fun and frivolity and creativity. And of course, one of the things they've discovered is that one of the key key elements for people to be creative is for them to be bored.
Mhm.
Boredom is the catalyst for lots of creativity, and I think most of us are afraid to let ourselves get bored. We keep filling our time with things because we're afraid of being bored, when actually it's that holy leisure, that mental leisure, that space of nothingness that allows a lot of creativity and joy and fun and things like that, and which is really hard when you have a life that demands such focused attention on tasks just continually. So carving that out is, in a sense, committing to finding time for joy and creativity and fun, I think.
Yes, that's very true, Judy. And Benedict was very clear that there would be artists and artisans in the monasteries, and he supported that. The only time he really talks about it, though, is when the artists and the artisans aren't doing what they're supposed to do, when they're becoming rather full of themselves. And then he legislates for them. But the fact that he has to legislate for people who are having too much fun in his eyes, and the wrong kind of fun, says that that was happening. He wouldn't have made a chapter on artists and the artisans if there weren't people who were doing those kinds of things and finding fulfillment in them.
A good note for us to end on. I think we are at our time and must unfortunately start to pivot toward worship. I think that we could talk with Reverend Kate Maxwell for much, much longer about the many topics that she has introduced to us. Thank you so very much, Reverend Kate Maxwell. It's been a lovely, lovely time.